So whenever I'm watching an ADCC match that's been posted on YouTube, a lot of the comments are about steroids, like how the guys are obviously using steroids, and this is oftentimes used to kind of like criticize the technical skill of the athletes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to say that a sport or a game is more technical than another. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about technical sophistication. This is one parameter we can use to discuss what makes a game or a sport technical. Technical sophistication can develop in two main ways, in width and in depth. All right, so technically sophisticated games that are narrow in terms of the constraints of what is and is not allowed will tend to generate a lot of depth in of technical sophistication, refinement over time, right? You're going to see people getting very, very good at key things, and what you're going to see is the fat cleaned off the technique, so to speak. Like a lot of the bullshit is going to be wiped away fast in a game, which a lot of people are actively competing in and taking seriously, and with relatively narrow parameters of the rule set. So you're going to have like a depth of technique, right? Now, width of technique is like, the opposite, right? So instead of just having like narrow parameters pushing the refinement of key areas, you see like a very liberal rule set, which allows a lot of different things. And there are a lot of different ways you can tackle going about trying to win the game, right? Consider the difference, for instance, between, let's say, MMA and boxing, right? This is like a really good example, contrasting a sport which has a relatively narrow rule set, which pushes for refinement and depth, one which is more about width. Now, of course, in both areas, you have a degree of technical sophistication developed in terms of depth and width. These two things are always happening at the same time. It's just about the degree to which a game favors one over the other. Now, I would argue that the level of preference a game offers towards width or depth is ultimately irrelevant to the question of whether the game itself is actually technical. It's sort of like semantics here, right? Because these are different ways of characterizing what makes something technical, right? Boxing is clearly very technical. MMA is clearly very technical. They're just pushing technique in different ways, right? Now, the second major thing we have to think about when it comes to technique is not just about the range of technique allowed in a game and how that encourages refinement of depth or refinement of width. Clearly, technique allowed in a game and how that encourages refinement of depth or refinement of width. We also have to ask ourselves the limitation of pure technique in the game. What I mean by this is that when we look at games, we should also be asking ourselves the extent to which technique alone is what is required to win. Okay? So, there is no game where technique alone is required to win. And in fact, I would say the idea that technique could ever be completely divorced from other factors is sort of a fantasy, right? It's not a real thing. Okay? Let's compare chess to, let's say, ADCC. Okay? Now, of course, I would say in chess, technique is going to be higher than an ADCC in terms of the requirement. So, for instance, in ADCC, do you need to be technical to win? Yes. However, technique alone is not it's not the only thing that you need to win. You also need certain physical components. It's basically impossible to win without that. Switching hands because my thumb is getting tired. Okay, so do you need some sort of physical component in chess? I mean, you kind of do, actually. I would argue that, cognitive capacity, right? It's kind of inarguable that certain people are imbued with higher natural cognitive capacity than others, right? And that's going to give you sort of an undue advantage that maybe other people don't have. However, largely, that's sort of a little nebulous, right? Like, how do we really measure that, right? Cognitive advantage. Regardless, technique is going to be the primary factor deciding who wins and loses in chess. Now, I would argue that it is still that way in grappling. Technique is the largest factor that's going to determine who wins or loses, but the degree to which physical components also feature in is going to be higher than in a game like chess. So you can think of a game as being a balancing act. Who wins in the game is going to be a balancing act between certain technical components and other intangible factors. Like it could be like physical, mental, emotional factors as well, right? So no game is purely technical. Okay, no game is purely an abstract contest of pure technique. That doesn't exist. That's a fantasy. Okay, so when we ask ourselves if a game is technical, it's actually a very nuanced question. The main thing I think we're asking is the degree of technical sophistication which the game allows, combined with the technical, the degree to which technique is the primary factor leading to victory in the game. Okay, so now let's look at some things, some games which are oftentimes compared. Gi versus no gi, which is more technical? Well, I would argue that gi has a lower athletic ceiling, like a lower athletic requirement than no gi. Okay, it's easier to control people who are like super freak athletes in the gi. In no gi, it's easier to get away with things because of if you're like extremely athletic, you can like use that to compensate for lack of technique in certain areas, which it's really hard to do that in the gi. So I do think that the gi, in that sense, can be said to be more technical, right? There's a lower athletic ceiling required to be successful in gi competition than I think that there is in no gi competition. However, in terms of technical sophistication, I don't think there's really any major difference between gi and no gi. People oftentimes cite, they say, oh, there's more techniques in the gi. I don't really think that that's necessarily true. I think that it just changes things very dramatically how the techniques manifest. I don't actually think there are more or less techniques, especially with the current rule sets, with leg locks being completely banned in basically every gi rule set. That's a major area of grappling which you're cutting off, so that area only exists in no gi, so that you can't really say I think that there are more techniques in the gi. I mean, I'm not sure. It would be tricky to sit down and try to measure this, but just from it's my own personal observations, I don't really think that it's fair to say that there's more technique in one versus the other. Switching hands again. Anyway, I think, however, it is fair to say that the athletic requirements in the gi are less, which, if we want to say that makes it more technical, okay, fair enough. I will say, though, however, I think in both gi and no gi, the primary deciding factor whether you win or lose is technique. I think there is a certain athletic, you got to meet a certain level of athletic requirements to be successful in either, to be frank. But once you've met that, it's technique that's going to be really the deciding factor. And of course, more athleticism, more strength, more speed, it's not going to hurt you whatsoever. But once you've met that basic threshold, that's the word I was looking for, threshold. Once you've met that basic threshold, it's really technique that is going to be the chief deciding factor. I have not put anywhere near as much time into gi study and training that I have into no gi. And I think it would be interesting what my views would be if I did. I'm basically a pure no gi guy, but I look at the gi and I study it because I'm very interested in grappling, generally speaking. And, it's interesting to me. My current opinion is that the gi is, in a sense, a more refined game in that it pushes for depth more than width. I think that in the gi, when you watch high-level gi guys, there's less crazy stuff happening, right? There's less experimentation, so to speak. It still happens, but it's a little more narrow than in no gi. Similarly, right, I would say the same thing is something we can observe with freestyle wrestling and like ADCC, right? ADCC is much wider. The possible range of options is a lot broader. You have way more things you could potentially do. Whereas in freestyle wrestling, it's much more narrow. So I think the gi is a more narrow game with more depth in the specific things which are required to win at a high level. Whereas I think that no-gi, you have a bit more options in terms of your approach, what you're gonna do, how you're gonna make it to the top. I think that both are very interesting and worth studying. And it's like I said, it's definitely possible that my opinion on this topic will change because there are some things in the gi that I don't really understand at a super high level, like the lapel game. I've watched it, but because it doesn't directly apply to like my personal goals, I haven't really spent too much time on it. So it's possible that what I'm saying, I'll change my opinion in a few years. But as of right now, that's my current way of thinking about these things.